Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 1080 Ti Founders Edition PCB. Now, interestingly enough, the PCB here is exactly the same as what you would see on a Titan X Pascal. So that means the actual copper fiberglass sandwich that, pushes all the electrons move through. That's exactly the same. However, NVIDIA has changed the components that are used on the that are actually attached to it, and they have added more components.
But before getting into Buildzoid's analysis, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their upcoming 1080 Ti FTW3 ICX card. You can learn more in the link in the description below or watch our previous ICX review.
There's a lot less stuff missing from this PCB than compared to the Titan X's. And by missing, I mean unpopulated MOSFET mounts and that. Really, the only thing that's a big loss compared to the Titan X PCB is this memory chip right here, which, incidentally, even if you had a BGA rework machine, if you had BGA soldering equipment, you can't add that GDDR5X chip back, as NVIDIA disables the 32-bit memory interface for that memory chip in the GPU core itself. So you're not getting that back. That is disabled completely. No chance of getting that working. Now then, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the actual VRMs on the card and talk a little bit about what they're made up of. So first things first, up here in the top left, we find a 1.8 volt VRM. This powers NVIDIA, some of the PLLs of the GPU. It also powers the BIOS, so the EEPROM of the NVIDIA cards actually runs on 1.8 volts, so it takes care of that. And this voltage does absolutely nothing for overclocking. It's just necessary for the card to function. So, not really that important. Now then, down here, we find another one of these not really that important voltages. This is the PEX, or also /PLL voltage. It does take care of some internal circuitry for the GPU, as well as some internal PLLs. Again, it's a case of if this voltage is not present on the card card will not function. This one sits at 1.02 volts at stock, and it can help with overclocking to tweak it up or down under LN2. But on air cooling and water cooling, it does absolutely nothing for overclocking capabilities. Now then, moving on, we finally get to a VRM that actually does something for overclocking. This is the VCore VRM, and unfortunately, because this is Pascal, it doesn't do much. So this supplies the bulk of the GPU's power to the GPU core, runs most of the compute logic in the core, sits at around 1.08 volts by stock. Maximum voltage limited by NVIDIA is 1.09, 3 volts. It's questionable if it actually can hold that voltage steady, but that is the maximum voltage you can set in software. Now, unfortunately, so, you can't really push this voltage that far. However, this VRM is the one that you'll see most custom cards significantly changing, and it is rather important for LN2 overclocking, but for air-cooled and water-cooled overclocking, it really doesn't matter as long as there's enough power available for 2.1 gigahertz overclocks, which is generally what pretty much every Pascal card can hit if you get lucky. Generally the clocks end up between 2 to 2.1 gigahertz, and from what I've been told, if you significantly increase the core voltage through physical mods or a certain modded BIOS, which exists for only one card currently. If you significantly increase the voltage, you do not gain that much core clock that it makes it worth it, and the power draw increase is quite significant. So, while this VRM has been very important on other architectures, on Pascal, it doesn't really do much until you pull have the card below 0 again, unfortunately. So that's your VCore VRM. And above it, we find the memory VRM, which is another case of doesn't really do much for air-cooled or water-cooled overclocking. This powers the GDDR5X memory chips. They run on 1.35 volts. and they don't really need a whole lot of power, and tweaking this voltage can get you a little bit more frequency out of the GDDR5X memory chips. It's mostly useful, again, on LN2, where every couple megahertz helps. On air or water cooling, you'll just massively increase the power draw for very little actual performance increase. So, also, you can't actually access this VRM through software whatsoever. So then, finally, moving on, we have another 1.8 volt VRM, which I'm not entirely sure where it's located. I think it's somewhere in this area of the PCB. Again, I'm working off of photos, not the actual card. Like, I don't have the card in hand, so it's rather hard for me to be accurate with a lot of these things. And it should be somewhere in this area, and that's a 1.8 volts voltage, and that's known as the VPP. And that's a voltage necessary for the GDDR5X chips to run. It does absolutely nothing for overclocking, so not worth worrying about whatsoever. Though this voltage might be tied to this VRM. I'm not entirely sure. I've started noticing that some NVIDIA, like 1080s, GTX 1080s had a dedicated one for this, which is 1.8 volts, and it was in this area. Titan XPs, I'm not sure, so I might be wrong about that one. Either way, it doesn't really matter that much unless you're trying to revive a dead card, in which case I really hope you have a working one, because that's the best way to reference what could be wrong. Now then, with that out of the way, let's take a look at the vCore and the memory VRM in more detail. Even though they don't really do much for overclocking, you probably want to know what they are and aren't capable of. So, the vCore VRM is a bit of an odd thing, as we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inductors, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 drivers. So this is perfectly fine, the driver count at least. 8 drivers is perfectly fine, as this VRM is run by the UP9511 voltage controller from UPI Semiconductor. And this is an 8-phase voltage controller with up to 600 kilohertz switching frequency, which is actually on the low side for VRM controllers. A lot of other voltage controllers will go up to 1 megahertz or even 2 megahertz. However, that is not that important, because really high switching frequency in your VRM means low power efficient. Basically, it ruins your power efficiency, as the VRM will be basically burning heat to turn the MOSFETs on and off more times than is necessary. It can help with the VRM's ability to regulate voltage under transient loads, as the VRM basically the voltage controller has more chances per second to tweak the current going through each phase. However, it again, like we've seen that custom cards on the custom 10 series cards do not clock any better than the reference cards so far. So again, this doesn't really matter unless you're doing LN2 overclocking, where the power draw is significantly higher and the VRM actually has to deal with significantly bigger load swings. So the 600 kilohertz limit here really isn't an issue. What is an issue is that we have 8 drivers and 7 inductors. How does that work? Also, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 MOSFETs. So we have enough MOSFETs and drivers to build an 8-phase VRM, but we only have 7 inductors. So what on earth is going on here? Well, NVIDIA has decided that they're going to share this inductor between these 2 MOSFETs and these 2 MOSFETs. And this is done so that they can balance the 12-volt power supplies present in the GPU. So your 6-pin and your 8-pin are not actually sharing their 12-volt layer of copper. Each of those goes into a different copper power plane. So one part of this VRM will be wired to the 8-pin, and the other part of this VRM will be wired to the 6-pin, and some of the VRMs on this card will be running off of your PCIe slot connector, and possibly this phase might be too. I'm not entirely sure, because from the photo I can't tell you what these MOSFETs are actually wired to. However, this is entirely done by NVIDIA to basically let them balance where the card pulls its power from. I'm not even sure that they actively use it. Well, actually, no, they would be using it since they did put components on the PCB there. So otherwise that would be a horrific waste. They could just leave them out. So yeah, so this is basically done by NVIDIA to balance the power draw between the different 12 volt sources. It doesn't really do much for the VRM's current capability because all the other phases are still limited to only 2 MOSFETs, whereas this phase alternatingly uses 4. So this phase is the least likely to fail in case you push a really high, if you have cooling issues on the VRM and push a very high amount of current through it. Now then, let's talk about current capabilities. NVIDIA has opted for FD PC 8016S MOSFETs from Fairchild, dual MOSFETs from Fairchild Semiconductor. And so dual MOSFETs means that this chip right here has 2 MOSFETs in it. There's a high side FET and a low side FET. So basically the end result is that we now have 2 dual FETs per phase, so you actually have 4 MOSFETs in each phase. The reason for this is that the 2 ICs share the current load, which leads to them sharing the thermal load, which means lower VRM operating temperatures, as well as higher efficiency, because a big part of VRM efficiency is the heat lost on the on the resistance of the MOSFET. So if you double up the number of MOSFETs, you basically get half the electrical resistance through the MOSFET. So that gives you a nice efficiency boost as well as a improvement in thermals. Now, the Fairchild Semiconductor FDPC8016S MOSFETs are pretty high-end. Well, are actually really, like, they're not but Fairchild does make better MOSFETs than this, but among all the MOSFETs available, these are really, really nice. They offer extremely low switch on and off timings, and they also have very low RDS on, which means that with NVIDIA's claim of this VRM being capable to do, so NVIDIA says that this VRM is capable of delivering about 250 amps. If you actually push that much current through this VRM, you're only going to be dumping 16 watts of heat, which is really not that much. So if you actually upgrade the VRM's cooling to handle a lot more, you can push as much as even 400 amps, at which point you'll be hitting about 40 watts heat output on the VRM, assuming 600 kilohertz switching frequency, which is the limit of the voltage controller. I'm not sure that NVIDIA would actually run the VRM at 600 kilohertz. I can't tell you what they run the VRM at from a photo, unfortunately. So 400 amps, 40 watts of heat output, but where is the absolute hard limit, assuming that the VRM is at 125 degrees and you have infinitely capable cooling, as long as that cooling keeps it within 125 degrees? Well, theoretically, this VRM could go up to 800 amps. We do have a lot of MOSFETs here. Do keep that in mind. That number does work out. These MOSFETs are very, very capable, assuming you could actually cool 800 amps of going through this VRM, because that would generate 156 watts of heat, which, to give you an idea of what you need to cool that with, that's like a Hyper 212 Evo literally just sitting on top of the VRM. Not really practical, not really doable. Your VRM is going to fail if you try to push 800 amps because it's going to overheat and basically destroy itself. Now then, moving on to the memory VRM, which, again, not that important, but important enough that I'm going to talk about it, uses different MOSFETs from a different company. These are Alpha and Omega Semiconductor E6930s. These are worse than the Fairchild Semiconductor MOSFETs. However, they are ridiculous overkill, as this memory VRM is 2 phases. We have 2 inductors that you can't see because they're under thermal pads, and we do have 4 of these MOSFETs, and these are again dual FETs. So there are actually 2 MOSFETs in each of those ICs. These are the exact same MOSFETs that NVIDIA used on the Titan X Pascal, except they only used 1 of them in each phase, and they also used them for the V-Core, and they didn't do 2 of them per phase. So, like, this card got a significant upgrade. The V-Core VRM has better MOSFETs and more of them, and the memory VRM has the same MOSFETs and more of them. So this card is really, really nice compared to like the Titan X Pascal's PCB. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the memory VRM will never really exceed will be between 20 and 30 amps of power draw, depending on how much load is on the GDDR5X memory chips and the memory system. And that's really not that much. And this set of MOSFETs, if you actually assume that kind of current going through them, would have very low switching and conduction losses. And I'm sort of suspecting that my calculation doesn't work when you put too little current through them, like when you run the calculation with too little current through it, because it spits out about 1 watt. Now, if you actually try to max out this VRM at 240 amps, 44 amps, it should put out 50 watts of heat, which is again completely uncoolable. Now, at a half that, it would be actually reasonable. Now, you know, GDDR5X doesn't need that much power. So this memory VRM is ridiculous overkill. And it is 2 true phases, as it is controlled by an UPI, well, UP, this thing right here is a UP1658, which is a 2-phase voltage controller with integrated gate drive. However, I'm pretty sure this is a dedicated MOSFET driver right there. I'm not entirely sure. As you can clearly see, that part of the photo is very blurry. And I do have other photos, but without the card in hand, it's really hard to say for sure. So that actually covers the build quality part of this video, and to be completely honest with you, I'm impressed. I'm really impressed with what NVIDIA has done with this PCB compared to the Titan X Pascal. It is a significant upgrade, as I said before. Better MOSFETs in the vCore VRM, more MOSFETs in the vCore VRM. The memory VRM is the same MOSFETs, but there's more of them. So that's also a nice upgrade. And like, really, there's nothing to complain about. For air cooling or water cooling, like, I don't see a great reason to go and buy a more expensive card just for the PCB, because, as I said, well, at least from what I've heard, on ambient cooling, you're really not going to be able to benefit from a significantly more powerful VRM or a significantly higher phase count VRM or just a VRM that has better voltage regulation. Won't really get you anything, as we've seen on past 10 series cards. Like 1080s all pretty much hit 2 to 2.1 gigahertz regardless of who makes them. So, assuming that you have enough cooling, of course. Which is not part of what I'm covering here. So I'm actually impressed because this PCB is significantly overbuilt. Like, NVIDIA could have gone with less MOSFETs, cheaper MOSFETs, and they didn't. So I'm impressed here. And, you know, really don't see, like, a reason why you would... assuming that you're going to be water cooling, I really don't see a reason why you would go and wait for a different PCB to for custom cards to come out, because getting water blocks for those is going to be harder and everything. So if you're just water cooling, this PCB is great. If you're air cooling, then you have to put up with the Founders Edition cooler, which is always going to be worse than the custom coolers that are available on the other cards, which is really what you want to go after with 1080s. So then, that covers the build quality. Let's do some modding on this card, because evidently it's strong enough. Let's try blow it up. If you want to mod the power limit of NVIDIA cards beyond what the software allows, there's a very simple solution for you. The NVIDIA cards monitor their current draw with shunt resistors located here, here, and here. Now, there's one issue with actually modding these. Shunt resistors measure power draw by basically measuring the voltage drop across them. And the problem here is that the mod works by shorting the current resistors, which lowers their electrical resistance, which lowers the voltage drop across them when you push current through them. The problem with that is if you short them out too well, so like let's say you take solder and just solder right across one of those, you're going to end up in a situation where the NVIDIA driver will notice that the GPU's reported power draw is way too low for any kind of realistic scenario, and it'll put the card in safety mode, And safety mode for NVIDIA cards means that the GPU core is stuck at 139 megahertz, pretty much making the card completely useless. So what you end up having to do if you want to actually mod the power limit on NVIDIA cards is you either have to buy other shunt resistors and put them in parallel with the ones already present on the card. If you're going to be doing that, you don't really want to drop the resistance below 1/3 of what it currently is. So this right here is a 5 milliohm, so you would want to drop it to, say, you wouldn't want to drop below 2 milliohms resistance, and you can do a calculation for parallel resistors. Now, the simpler, less mathematical option is to just take some liquid metal thermal paste, so say Thermal Grizzly Conductinaut or Cool Laboratory Liquid Ultra, and just apply that to the shunt. Of course, that does leave exposed liquid metal sitting on a shunt inside your system, so, you know, some people aren't comfortable with that solution, but don't apply too much. Apply just enough to actually short the shunt, but not so much that you have a great big blob of it on there. Otherwise, that'll drip off and cause all kinds of issues. So you can actually do it with the liquid metals. And the benefit to doing it with the liquid metals instead of soldering is that you can actually remove the liquid metals with ethanol, acetone, or isopropanol. You can remove it, and it looks like you've never actually modified the card whatsoever, which is really useful if you want to send the card back in for RMA after it died. And that's really up to you to decide if that's morally wrong or not. I'm just saying that's an option. The other thing is, if you overdo the mod, it's really easy to clean it up. So that's the other thing. Now, one word of warning about the Cool Laboratory Liquid Ultra. I've had one person tell me that they used Cool Laboratory Liquid Ultra and it ate the solder. So if you're going to be doing the mod, I recommend using Thermal Grizzly Conductinaut, as that one I know for sure does not eat solder. Cool Laboratory Liquid Ultra, for most people, it's worked fine from what I've heard, except this one exception which I got a message about where it actually straight up ate the solder. So, and the shunt fell off, and that breaks the card because the shunts literally connect the 6-pin to the VRM. Like, that shunt is the only connection between the 6-pin and the VRM. So if that falls off, the card is not going to work. You're going to have to resolder that back on there, and then your warranty is toast. So that's less than ideal. So that's really all there is to say about NVIDIA cards. Any more advanced mods are, in my opinion, I'm not going to cover any more advanced mods here. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have subscribed, there's the notifications button in case you want to be notified immediately about every video put out by the people here at Gamers Nexus. If you would like to support us, we do have a Patreon. You could go and donate to that. If you would like to see more content like this, you can head over to my channel, which is called Actually Hardcore Overclocking, where I do PCB breakdowns and a lot of overclocking. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.